You can't prepare for it. Nobody tells you what it feels like when the engines just stop. It's an unnatural silence, a silence that weighs tons. We were 30,000 feet in the air, and suddenly we were just a falling stone. People were screaming, praying. I just froze. And then, through the broken cockpit door, I heard it. It wasn't over the intercom. It was the pilot's real voice, cracking with pure terror. He screamed, "We lost all engines." A second later, I saw the tops of the trees coming up at us like green missiles. I knew I was going to die. What I didn't know was that the impact was only the beginning of the real hell. This is the story of how I survived when physics said it was impossible. But before I tell you how I made it out of that hell, I want to know how far this incredible story is reaching. Tell me right now in the comments, what city are you listening from? It's ironic. 90 minutes before that moment, my only concern was that the plane's Wi-Fi was too slow. 90 minutes. It was Horizon Air Flight 203, a Bombardier Q400, a propeller plane. To me, it was just a glorified bus taking me from Boise, Idaho, back home to Seattle. It had been a 3-day tech conference. I was exhausted. My name is Alex Mason, I'm 32, and I'm a software engineer. My world is data, logic, probabilities. The probability of being in a plane crash is 1 in millions. I always scoffed at that. I got on the plane, put my carry-on in the overhead. Seat 12F, by the window. The perfect spot for no one to bother me. I sat down, pulled out my laptop before the doors even closed, and put on my noise-canceling headphones. I had work to finish. I vaguely remember the flight attendant doing the safety demonstration. I ignored her, like I always do. Life vests, oxygen masks, irrelevant. We were flying over the Cascade Mountains, not the ocean. If something went wrong at this altitude, none of that would matter. The plane took off. It was a smooth flight. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples. Outside my window, the propellers spun, a constant, monotonous drone that my music almost managed to block out. I was frustrated. My code wouldn't compile. The spotty Wi-Fi was keeping me from connecting to the office server. I remember typing out a draft email complaining about the service. How insignificant all of that seems now. About an hour into the flight, we were over the densest part of the national forest, the green nothing, as they call it. The flight attendant came by offering drinks. I waved a hand. "No thanks," without even looking up from my screen. She smiled and moved on. I saw the woman next to me in the aisle seat. She was older, maybe in her 60s, and she was knitting on a plane. She seemed calm, at peace. The captain came over the intercom, announcing we were beginning our initial descent into Seattle. 30 more minutes and I'd be home. I closed my laptop. The Wi-Fi had finally cut out completely. I leaned back in my seat and looked out the window. The clouds were thick below us. The snow-capped tips of the mountains poked through the white cotton like islands. It was beautiful, in a distant, abstract way. That's when I felt the first jolt. It wasn't normal turbulence. Turbulence shakes you. This was a bang, like a giant hammer had struck the bottom of the plane. My drink, which I had asked for minutes earlier and forgotten, jumped from the tray table and spilled all over my pants. The knitting woman dropped her needles. "What was that?" she whispered. Before I could answer, it happened. It wasn't a loud noise. It was the absence of noise. The deep, steady hum of the turboprop engines just stopped. Both of them. At the same time. My noise-canceling headphones suddenly had nothing to cancel. I only heard the high-pitched whistle of the wind. The plane hung in the air for a second. We all just looked at each other. In that 1 second, I saw more raw fear in the flight attendant's eyes than I have ever seen in my life. And then we fell. The silence was the most terrifying part. It's not a peaceful silence, not the kind you seek in a library or in the middle of the night. It is a violent silence, an absolute vacuum where the reassuring thrum of physics used to be. The constant, steady drone of the propellers, that vibration that lulls you to sleep in the back of your mind, was just gone. For 1 second, the plane just seemed to float, as if the universe was holding its breath. I looked at the knitting woman beside me. Her eyes were fixed on the seatback in front of her, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. No one screamed. Not yet. I think we were all trapped in the same state of absolute dumbfounded disbelief. My engineer's brain kicked in immediately, trying to find a logical explanation. Is this a normal procedure? Do they shut down the engines to glide? No, that's absurd. A drill? Impossible. I scanned the cabin for the flight attendant. She was at the back, near the galley, and her face was a white mask. She was gripping the door frame so hard her knuckles were white. She knew this wasn't normal. Her fear was what broke my denial. Then the plane tipped. Sharply. It wasn't a gentle descent. It was as if the floor simply fell away from under us. My stomach shot up into my throat. That roller coaster feeling, the one that lasts for a split second at an amusement park, was now stretching. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. The plane began to shake, not the vibration of engines, but the shudder of the airframe itself being forced past its limits by the wind. The whistle of the air against the fuselage turned into a high-pitched howl, like the plane itself was screaming. That's when the panic started. The first scream came from the back, a deep-voiced man, and that's all it took. Like a dam breaking, the cabin exploded into a chaos of shrieks, sobs, and prayers. People were grabbing the armrests, their bodies pressed hard against the seatbelts. The woman beside me began praying quietly. A rosary I hadn't seen before was suddenly in her hands. "Oh God, save us, please God, save us." I couldn't scream. I was paralyzed, my mind racing at 1,000 miles an hour. We lost both engines. Is that possible? Bird strike, icing, catastrophic fuel failure. What happens when you lose both engines on a turboprop? You become a very heavy glider, a brick with wings. I checked my seatbelt. I pulled it so tight it bit into my waist. I looked out the window. The clouds that had been below us were now all around us, wrapping us in a thick gray fog. I couldn't see the ground. I couldn't see the sky. There was just gray. The plane stabilized for a moment, or at least it stopped nosediving. But it was swaying now, side to side, like a falling leaf. The pilot was fighting the aircraft. I could feel it. I could feel the jerky movements of the ailerons trying to keep us level. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your seats. Remain seated," the flight attendant said over the intercom. Her voice was shaking so badly you could barely understand the words. She was trying to maintain that professional calm, but terror was seeping through every syllable. The oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. They hit people in the head, dangling in front of our faces like little yellow ghosts. The irony hit me. We weren't losing cabin pressure. We were losing the plane. No. One reached for the masks at first. They were too busy screaming. I saw one man a few rows up try to stand up as if he could somehow run away. "Sir, sit down," the flight attendant yelled. I grabbed the mask. The plastic smelled sterile. I pulled it over my face and breathed. The air flowed. A part of my brain latched onto that. The air is flowing. The emergency systems work. But the main system, the engines, was dead. Utterly dead. I looked out the window again. The propellers were motionless. Just hanging there. Static against the gray sky. Like monuments to our failure. The plane gave another violent jolt, this time sideways. There was a deafening metallic groan from the wing. I looked out at my wing. The right wing. It seemed intact, but the sound. It was the sound of tired metal, of metal screaming in protest. The people around me were losing it. A college-aged kid across the aisle was openly weeping, talking into his phone, probably trying to send a last message. "Mom, I love you, Mom, the plane's—" I felt an intense cold. The temperature in the cabin was dropping fast. Without the engines, there was no heat. The cold just added to the sense of unreality. I was shaking, but I didn't know if it was from the cold or from the fear. Every second felt like an hour. We were in this suspended agony, falling through nothing, just waiting for the inevitable end. I knew what was below us. The Cascades, mountains, millions of trees as tall as skyscrapers. This wasn't going to be a soft landing. The plane broke through the cloud layer. Suddenly the gray was gone, replaced by a dark, textured green. It was trees, hundreds of thousands of them. They were so close. I could see individual branches. I could see the snow on some of the peaks. We weren't flying over them. We were falling into them. They were rushing up at us at a terrifying, impossible speed. And in that moment of absolute, horrifying clarity, when the end was visible, the thing that sealed my fate happened. The cockpit door burst open. It didn't just swing open. It was ripped from its hinges by the extreme torque twisting the fuselage. It slammed into the bulkhead of the first row, and from the dark cockpit, I heard the pilot's voice. This wasn't the calm, professional captain who had welcomed us aboard. This was the voice of a terrified man. He screamed, and his voice cracked. "Brace! Brace! We lost all engines. We're going in." "We're going in." Not, "We're going to land." "We're going in." Those were the last words I heard before the world became a hell of green and tearing metal. There is no time to think. The moment the pilot screamed, "We're going in," was not a warning. It was a eulogy. It was the full stop at the end of our collective sentence. The cabin erupted. It was a sound I will never forget, a symphony of pure primal terror. It wasn't just screaming, it was wailing, a deep, guttural sound of people realizing their life was over. I instinctively grabbed the seat in front of me and pushed my head down, forcing my body into the brace position they always show in the safety cards, the one I always ignored. My glasses were crushed against my knees. My laptop bag, under the seat in front of me, was pulverized. Everything became sensory overload. The first sound was not the ground, it was the trees. A deafening roar like 1,000 giant zippers being undone at once, as the tops of the 100-foot-tall Douglas firs began to tear at the belly of the plane. It wasn't a crash. It was a shredding. The aircraft was fighting, but the forest was winning. I could hear the branches, thick as telephone poles, snapping and tearing through the aluminum skin. The howl of the wind was replaced by the splintering of wood and the shrieking of metal being torn apart. The plane lurched violently to the right. I was slammed against the window. The woman next to me was thrown against me, her prayers turning into a single high-pitched shriek. I watched, frozen in horror, as the wing on my side, the 12F side, struck a massive tree trunk. The wing didn't just break. It sheared off. It folded back on itself like paper, and in a flash of sparks and leaking fuel, it was just gone. The plane, now critically unbalanced, began to cartwheel. We were no longer flying. We were tumbling end over end, a metal coffin being chewed apart by the mountain. The noise. I cannot describe the noise. It was the loudest thing I have ever heard. A physical force that battered my ears and shook my bones. It was the sound of metal screaming as it tore. It was the sound of every bag in the overhead bins becoming a projectile, of seats ripping free from their bolts, of the fuselage itself cracking open. The cabin lights exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging us into a chaotic darkness, lit only by the horrifying strobe effect of the emergency lights on the floor and the flashes of metal sparking against trees. I felt a sudden, intense cold and a spray of wetness. It was rain and dirt and pine needles. The side of the plane 2 rows ahead of me had simply vanished, ripped open to the elements. I could see the blur of the forest rushing past, not below us, but beside us. The smell was overwhelming. Jet fuel, burning electrical wires, and the sharp, clean scent of fresh splintered pine. It was the smell of our destruction. My body was being thrown around like a rag doll, held in place only by the thin nylon strap across my waist. My ribs felt like they were cracking. My head hit the window frame with a sickening thud. The G-forces were unbearable. I felt my organs being crushed inside me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. I was just existing in this moment of pure, violent chaos. I remember a flash of clarity, a single calm thought in the middle of the pandemonium. So this is it. This is how I die. I'm an engineer from Seattle, and I'm dying in a forest because the Wi-Fi was slow. It was the most absurd, ridiculous thought to have, and it was the last coherent one I had. Then came the final impact. It wasn't one single event. It was a series of catastrophic failures. The plane's body, already weakened, hit the forest floor. The sound was less of a crash and more of a disintegration. The floor beneath my feet buckled and tore open. I felt the bolts holding my row of seats snap. The woman next to me was gone. Her seat, the aisle seat, was ripped away into the darkness. I was alone in my row. My section of the fuselage, my row 12F, and the row behind me, row 13, was torn free from the rest of the plane. I felt a sudden sickening lurch, a feeling of falling again. But this wasn't a nosedive. This was a sideways spinning drop. My section of the plane, this small chunk of metal and seats, was ripped clean off and flung through the air. It fell, tumbling, for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 or 3 seconds. It crashed through a canopy of thick branches. The branches acted like a net, like giant green arms slowing us down. There was a final bone-jarring impact as we slammed into something massive and solid, the sound of cracking wood and groaning metal. And then, silence. A silence even more profound than the one that came after the engines failed. It was the silence of the end. The screaming had stopped. The tearing metal had stopped. There was only the sound of the rain, gently tapping on the twisted metal shell around me. I was hanging sideways, held in place by my seatbelt. My head was throbbing. My chest was on fire. Everything hurt. I was alive. I opened my eyes, but there was nothing to see. Just absolute, total darkness. Darkness. Absolute and suffocating. The first sensation was the smell. It was an overwhelming wave of sharp, fresh pine, so strong it stung my nostrils, mixed with the acrid, sickeningly sweet scent of jet fuel. And then the cold. A wet, seeping cold that chilled me to the bone. Rain was falling on my face. Why was rain falling on my face? My thoughts were slow, thick, like molasses. I tried to move, and a white-hot bolt of pain shot through my entire chest, stealing my breath. I gasped, but only a wet, shallow croak came out. I was hanging. My body was pressed hard against something, and my entire weight was being held by the seatbelt digging deep into my waist. I wasn't sitting upright. I was tilted sideways, almost upside down. My head was throbbing with a dull, heavy pulse. I reached up to touch my face, and my fingers came back sticky and wet. I couldn't tell if it was rain or blood. Maybe both. Everything hurt. My ribs felt like a set of broken glass shards inside me, shifting with every tiny movement. My eyes slowly, painfully, began to adjust to the pitch black. The darkness wasn't uniform. There were shapes, jagged outlines against a slightly less black sky. I wasn't inside the cabin, not really. I could see stars, faint and blurry, peeking through the canopy of leaves above me. The rain was real. I was outside. My mind tried to piece it together. The flight, the Wi-Fi, the bang, the silence, the pilot's scream, the trees. Oh God, the trees. The sound of shredding metal. It wasn't a nightmare. It had happened. I was still strapped into my seat 12F. But seat 12F was no longer inside a Bombardier Q400. It was part of a mangled piece of wreckage, a jagged chunk of the fuselage maybe 10 feet long. I could feel the torn edges of the metal beside my head. I looked to my left, where the aisle and the knitting woman should have been. There was nothing. Just empty, black air. The floor had been ripped away. The entire section of the plane I was in had been torn off like a piece of paper. My row and the row behind me had been violently separated from the rest of the plane. I could see the woman who had been in 13F. She was still in her seat, just behind me, but she was slumped forward, motionless. I couldn't see her face. I didn't want to. The realization of where I was hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't on the ground. The piece of wreckage I was in was wedged, balanced precariously, high up in the branches of a massive ancient tree. I could feel the entire structure swaying gently in the wind, groaning under its own weight. I tried to look down. Through a gap in the torn floor I could see nothing, just more darkness, a dizzying void. I was suspended, maybe 50, maybe 100 feet above the forest floor. I was in a metal nest, perched on the edge of oblivion. "Hello?" I tried to yell. It came out as a pathetic whisper, choked by pain. I tried again, pushing the air from my lungs, ignoring the fire in my ribs. "Hello? Is anyone alive?" The only answer was the steady drumming of the rain on the aluminum skin above my head and the rustle of the wind through the endless pine needles. The silence from below was deafening. Where was the rest of the plane? Where were the other people? The screaming. It had just stopped. The silence was absolute. I listened, straining my ears, praying to hear a cry for help, a moan, anything. But there was nothing. Just the sounds of a forest that had swallowed a plane whole and returned to its quiet indifference. Panic, cold and sharp, began to cut through the fog of my concussion. I was alive, but I was severely injured. I was trapped in a metal cage, dangling 100 feet in the air, in the middle of a freezing storm, in a forest that could stretch for hundreds of miles. Nobody knew I was here. They would be looking for a fuselage, a crash site on the ground, not for 2 rows of seats tangled in the canopy of a Douglas fir. They would never find me. I fumbled for my phone in my pocket, My hand was shaking so badly I could barely control it. I felt the familiar smooth glass. I pulled it out. The screen was a spiderweb of shattered glass. I pressed the power button. Nothing. I pressed it again, holding it down, begging. Nothing. It was dead. A useless black rectangle. I wanted to scream again, but I didn't have the strength. I was completely, utterly alone. The logic in my engineer's brain, the part of me that always had a plan, was silent. It had no data for this. Probability had failed me. I had survived the unsurvivable, only to be left to die a slow, cold death. I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by the pain and the hopelessness, and then I heard it. It wasn't the rain. It wasn't the wind. It was a low, agonizing groan. It came from right behind me. Help. Me. It was a woman's voice. Weak, terrified, and very, very close. The passenger in 13F, the one I thought was dead, was alive. The voice cut through my fog of pain and self-pity like a razor. Help. Me. It was thin, watery, full of a terror that mirrored my own. For a split second, I felt a wave of profound relief. I am not alone. That relief was immediately crushed by a new, heavier burden. I am not alone, and someone is asking me for help. Me, the man who can barely breathe. The man pinned to his seat by a broken ribcage, dangling in the canopy of a dead forest. I tried to turn my head to look behind me. The movement sent a blinding, searing pain from my chest up into my neck. I cried out, a sharp intake of breath that felt like swallowing needles. My ribs were definitely broken. "I'm here," I managed to gasp, the words tearing at my throat. I'm right in front of you. What's your name?" The rain was relentless, drumming on the metal skin of our tiny prison, making it hard to hear. The whole structure creaked and groaned around us, shifting slightly, reminding us that our survival was balanced on the whim of a single, massive tree branch. I was terrified that any sudden movement, any shift in our combined weight, would send us plummeting into the darkness below. "Chloe," the voice whispered. "My name is Chloe. I can't move. I think my legs are—" She stopped, and her whisper turned into a choked sob, which then escalated into a high-pitched wail of agonizing pain. "It hurts! God, it hurts! My leg! It's stuck!" Her sudden scream of agony sent a fresh wave of adrenaline through me. Stuck was a bad word. Stuck meant the wreckage had her. "Okay, Chloe, okay. Just try to stay calm." "We're alive," I said, my voice shaking, trying to sound like someone in control when I felt like a terrified child. "We're alive. We just need to hold on." But holding on wasn't enough. It was pitch black. I couldn't see her. I couldn't see my own hands in front of my face. The sheer helplessness was suffocating. How do you help someone you can't even see when you yourself are critically injured? I can't feel my feet," she cried, her voice hysterical. "But my leg, it's on fire." That combination was terrifying. Numbness and fire. It meant nerve damage, or worse. I had to see. I had to get light. My phone was a useless brick of shattered glass. My laptop, it was somewhere in the darkness below. Pulverized with my laptop bag. Think, Alex, think. The overhead bins were gone. My pockets were empty except for the phone and my wallet. Then I remembered the woman who had been sitting next to me. The knitter, 12E. Her seat was gone, ripped into the void. But her purse? She had put it under her seat just before impact. I reached down, my whole body screaming in protest. The floor was buckled and torn, a mess of sharp metal edges. My fingers brushed against something. It wasn't my laptop bag. It was softer, leather. I grabbed it and pulled. It was her handbag, soaked and heavy. I ripped it open, my fingers fumbling with the clasp. I dumped the contents onto my lap, held in place by the tilt of the seat. Knitting needles which clattered uselessly onto the metal. A wallet, a half-eaten granola bar, a tangle of keys, and on the key ring, a tiny silver keychain light, the kind you get at a gas station. It was no bigger than my thumb. I grabbed it, my heart pounding. I pressed the tiny rubber button. A weak bluish-white beam of light cut through the darkness. It was pathetic. It was feeble. And it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I took a sharp, painful breath. "Chloe, I have a light. I'm going to shine it back at you. Don't move." I contorted my body, ignoring the grinding of my broken ribs, and pointed the tiny beam into the row behind me. The light found her. She was young, maybe 21 or 22. Her face was pale, streaked with rain and dirt. Her eyes were wide with a terror so profound it barely looked human. The light illuminated the small, mangled space, and it illuminated her leg. I almost dropped the light. Her left leg was pinned. A jagged piece of the aluminum seat frame from my own row, 12F, had been driven backward during the crash. It had punched clean through the soft part of her thigh, just above the knee, and pinned her entire leg to the bulkhead of the fuselage. The metal was dark and wet. I could see the white, splintered edge of her femur. My stomach turned. I fought back the urge to vomit. She followed my gaze, saw the beam of light on her own leg, and she screamed. It was not a scream of pain, but of pure, psychological horror. "Oh my God! Oh my God, no! Get it off! Get it off me!" She began to thrash, pulling against the metal spike. "Chloe, stop! Stop, you'll make it worse!" I yelled, my voice cracking. "Stop! You'll bleed out! You have to stay still!" Her thrashing was shaking the entire wreckage. The precarious balance we were on was being tested. The structure groaned, a deep metallic screech, and we shifted, tilting a few more degrees. We both froze. We're going to fall," she whimpered. "We're going to fall and die." "No," I said, the engineer in my brain slamming its fist on the panic button, desperate to take control. "No, we are not. Look at me, Chloe. Look at my face." I shone the weak light on myself, so she could see my eyes. "My name is Alex. I am a software engineer. My ribs are broken. You are pinned, but we are alive. We are alive. You cannot move. You cannot thrash. That piece of metal, it's probably the only thing keeping you from bleeding to death. It's acting as a plug. We have to wait. We have to wait for the sun. We can't do anything in the dark." I shone the light around her small space again. The man who had been sitting next to her, 13E, was slumped against the broken wall of the fuselage. His head was at an impossible angle. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the rain. He was dead. The woman in front of me, 11F, was gone. The knitter, 12E, was gone. In our tiny floating island of debris, there were 3 seats, 2 passengers, and 1 body. I found the granola bar that had fallen from the purse. "Chloe," I said, my voice softer. "Here." I reached back, my arm screaming in protest, and pushed it into her hand. "You have to eat this. You need to keep your strength." She just stared at it. I can't eat it," I ordered, with a firmness I didn't feel. "We have to survive this night. And when the sun comes up, I am going to figure out how to get us down from this tree. Do you understand me? We survive the night." She nodded, her hand weakly closing around the bar. I turned the light off to save the battery. The absolute darkness rushed back in, but it was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with her quiet sobbing, the sound of my own ragged breathing, and the endless cold rain. The night was the longest single period of time I have ever experienced. It wasn't sleep. It was a gray, agonizing limbo punctuated by Chloe's quiet whimpers and the grinding of my own broken bones every time I inhaled. The rain finally slowed to a drizzle, then stopped. But the cold that replaced it was a different kind of enemy. It was a wet, invasive cold that settled deep in my marrow. We were soaked. Every gust of wind that rustled the canopy sent a fresh tremor through our precarious perch, and with it, a new wave of icy air that cut through my thin conference polo shirt. I spent hours just listening for her breathing, listening for the sound of rescue, listening for any sign of other survivors. There was nothing, only the forest. When the first light of dawn finally came, it wasn't a beautiful sunrise. It was a slow, agonizing reveal. The pitch black faded to a dull, bruised gray, and the true horror of our situation was laid bare. I didn't need the keychain light anymore. I could see. I was 90, maybe 100 feet in the air. Our 2-row section of the fuselage was impaled on the shattered, massive limbs of an ancient Douglas fir. It was wedged between the main trunk and a colossal branch, tilted at a nauseating 45-degree angle. Below us was a sheer drop to the forest floor, a carpet of ferns and dark, wet earth. I could see the rest of the plane, or what was left of it. The main fuselage had carved a scar through the forest about 200 yards away from our tree. It was a mangled tube of white and red metal, shattered into 3 large pieces, silent and half buried in the mud. There was no fire, No smoke, just silence. The sight of it stole the air from my already aching lungs. There was no movement, no sign of life. They were all gone. "Alex?" Chloe's voice was weak. The cold had gotten to her. Her lips were a pale bluish color. Is it morning?" "It's morning," I said, my voice rough. "Chloe, we have to get down." "Down?" She looked past me, through the gaping hole where the aisle used to be, and saw the drop. A fresh wave of panic washed over her face. No, I can't. We'll fall. We have to wait. They'll come for us. They'll find us." "Chloe, look." I pointed with my chin toward the main wreckage. "They're looking for that. They aren't looking for this. They're not looking up in a tree 100 feet off the ground. We are invisible. And even if they fly a helicopter right over us, they won't see us through this canopy." I paused, hating the words I had to say next. "And your leg. Chloe, you need a doctor. That granola bar is gone. We have no water. If we stay here, we're not going to make it. The cold will kill us before the infection does." She started to cry. Silent, hopeless tears that tracked through the dirt on her face. "But how, Alex? How? We can't climb down. I can't even move." "You don't have to," I said. The engineer was back. The panic was still there, a cold knot in my stomach. But the problem was defined. We are at point A, the tree. We need to get to point B, the ground. We need a rope. I'm going to make one. I spent the next hour meticulously planning, every tiny movement sending agony through my torso. I was still strapped in. I had to be. I looked at our resources. In our small floating prison, we had the 2 seats in my row, 12F and the empty ghost seat of 12E. We had the 2 seats behind us, 13F, Chloe, and 13E, the dead passenger. That was 4 seatbelts. I fumbled, one-handed, with the buckle on the knitter's empty seat next to me. The simple mechanism was jammed with debris. I twisted and pulled, my fingers raw, until it finally clicked open. I pulled the heavy nylon strap free. It was maybe 6 feet long. It wasn't enough. "Chloe," I said gently, pointing the dead keychain light. "The man next to you, I need his seatbelt." She flinched, turning her head away from the body. "I can't. Alex, please. I have to. It's for us." I didn't wait for her permission. I had to get out of my own seat. This was the most dangerous part. I slowly, carefully, unbuckled my own belt. The sudden weight shift made the entire wreck groan. I froze, my heart hammering. It held. I was now balancing on the severely sloped, torn floor, using one hand to grip the armrest to keep from sliding out into the open air. The pain in my ribs was blinding. I gritted my teeth, tasting blood. I leaned over my seat, reaching back, into her row. I avoided looking at the man's face. I just fumbled for his belt, my hand brushing his cold, wet jeans. I found the buckle and released it. I pulled the strap free. Now I had 2. Then I got Chloe's, from her own seat. She wasn't using it. She was pinned by the metal. That was 3. I tried to get mine, but the buckle was jammed, bent, and crushed under the frame. It wouldn't budge. 3 belts. Maybe 15, 20 feet when tied together. A pathetic fraction of the 100 feet. We needed to descend. I scanned our prison again. My eyes landed on the ripped paneling above Chloe's head, the cabin interior, the curtains, the flight attendant's demonstration. In the event of a water landing, your seat cushion can be used as a flotation device. Useless. But then, the life vests. Where were they? Under the seats. I jammed my hand under my own seat cushion, 12F. My fingers hit the plastic pouch. I ripped it out. A bright yellow vest. I ripped it open. It was nylon. Strong, but small. I looked back at Chloe. "I need to check under your seat. And under his." She just nodded, her eyes closed. I braced myself and leaned back again, my broken ribs screaming. I retrieved the vest from under her seat, and then, holding my breath, I reached over her legs, past the spike, and under the seat of the dead man. I got his vest too. 3 vests, 3 seatbelts. Still not enough. I was desperate. My eyes scanned every inch, and then I saw it, tangled in the wreckage above. Our heads caught on a piece of the ceiling panel, was a section of the cabin curtain, the thick, heavy fabric they used to separate first class. It was torn, but a long section, maybe 30 feet, was hanging down, flapping gently in the breeze. It was snagged, but it was reachable if I stood. Standing was not an option. My legs were numb, my chest was on fire, but I had to. I used the headrest of my own seat to pull myself up. The world spun. The drop below me seemed to call my name. I was exposed, balanced on a tiny slanted piece of metal, 100 feet in the air. "Alex, don't!" Chloe screamed. I ignored her. I grabbed the curtain. I pulled. It held. I pulled harder, using my body weight. The sound of tearing fabric, and then it came free. A long, heavy blue cloth. I collapsed back into my seat, shaking, clutching the fabric, the belts, and the vests. It was a pile of junk, but it was hope. "This," I panted, holding up the tangle. "This is how we get down. I'll braid them. I'll tie them together." The rest of the day was a blur of agonizing, meticulous work, tearing the life vests into long, continuous strips, tying the seatbelts together with trembling, frozen fingers, using knots I hadn't used since Boy Scouts, braiding the curtain fabric into the nylon strips to give it strength. My ribs felt like they were grinding together, and I had to stop every few minutes, dizzy with pain. Chloe watched me, her face a mask of fear and hope. By the time the light began to fade, casting long, dark shadows through the forest, I had it. A grotesque, ugly, improvised rope. It was a patchwork of yellow vest, blue curtain, and black nylon. It was maybe 70 feet long. It wasn't long enough. It wouldn't reach the ground, but it was a start. As the cold of the second night began to settle in, a new, more terrifying thought dawned. My rope was too short, and Chloe couldn't climb. She was dead weight. I would have to lower her, and I would have to go down first to catch her. The second night in that tree was the closest I've ever come to true despair. The cold was a living thing, a predator that stalked us in the darkness. My broken ribs had stiffened, and every breath was a shallow, fiery battle. But my pain was nothing compared to Chloe's. The adrenaline and shock that had kept her going had faded, and the reality of her injury set in. She was shivering violently, not just from the cold, but from fever. The infection was starting. I could smell it, a faint metallic odor underneath the scent of pine and rain. She didn't cry anymore. She just produced a low, continuous moan that was almost worse than her screams. I sat there in the dark, my useless 70-foot rope in my lap, listening to her die. I knew, with the cold certainty of an engineer, that staying here was a death sentence. That rope, my pathetic patchwork of nylon and curtain, was too short. It wouldn't reach the ground. And even if it did, what was the plan? Chloe couldn't climb. She was dead weight. I'd have to lower her, and I, with a chest full of broken glass, would have to follow. But first, before any of that, I had to get her free. When the gray light of day 2 finally filtered through the canopy, I looked at the problem. The metal spike pinning her leg. It wasn't just in her. It was through her. It was a piece of my own seat's frame, aluminum alloy, designed to be lightweight but incredibly strong. I had no tools. I had the keychain light, the empty granola bar wrapper, and the knitting needles from the dead woman's purse. I grabbed one of the needles. It was long, thin, aluminum. I tried to use it as a lever, to jam it into the gap between the spike and the bulkhead to pry it loose. The moment I put any real pressure on it, the needle bent like a piece of wet spaghetti. Useless. "Chloe," I whispered. Her eyes fluttered open. They were glassy with fever. "This is going to hurt. This is going to hurt more than anything you've ever felt. But it's the only way. I have to pull you free." She didn't seem to understand. She just stared at me with those hazy, terrified eyes. "You have to help me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "When I say 3, I need you to push backward, away from the metal, as hard as you can. Do you understand?" She gave a tiny, jerky nod. I braced my feet against the buckled floor. I wrapped my arms around her waist from behind, my chest screaming in protest as I took her weight. "Okay, 1, 2. I didn't wait for 3. I couldn't. I just yelled "now" and pulled backward with every ounce of strength I had. The sound she made was not human. It was a shriek that ripped through the silent forest, a sound of such pure, unadulterated agony that it almost made me let go. I felt the horrific wet pop as the jagged metal tore free from her flesh and bone. We both collapsed backward, a tangle of limbs slamming against the bulkhead. The entire wreckage shuddered, groaning under the sudden shift. I looked at her leg. It was a ruin, a catastrophic mess of blood and tissue. I ripped a long strip from the blue curtain and tied it around her thigh, pulling it as tight as I possibly could, creating a desperate tourniquet. She had passed out. It was a mercy. Now, the rope. I tied one end of my makeshift line around the solid, unbent metal frame of my own seat, testing the knot until my fingers were raw. It had to hold. I gently, agonizingly, looped the other end under Chloe's arms, fashioning a crude harness. I dragged her unconscious body to the edge, to the gaping hole where the aisle used to be. The drop was terrifying. 100 feet. My rope was only 70. This was the moment my logic failed me. I couldn't lower her slowly. The rope was too jagged, too improvised. It would snag. It would burn my hands. It might even break with the friction. The only way was to lower her as far as I could, and then let go. She would fall the last 30 feet. There was no other choice. "I'm so sorry, Chloe," I whispered to her unconscious face. I braced myself and pushed her out into the empty air. Her body dropped. The rope went taut, jerking the entire wreckage. I paid out the line, the horrible patchwork of fabric and nylon burning through my hands, stripping the skin from my palms. The rope was flying now, faster and faster, and then, in a terrifying rush, it was gone. The end whipped past my hands. I heard a muffled thud from the forest floor far below, followed by a sickening silence. I had just thrown a girl from a tree. I stared at my raw, bleeding hands, shaking uncontrollably. I may have just killed her, but there was no time. Now it was my turn. I was alone in the nest. The silence was absolute. I untied the rope from the seat frame. I wrapped it around my own chest, under my arms. I looked down. It was so far. I took a deep, painful breath and stepped off the edge. The fall was immediate. The harness crushed my broken ribs, forcing the air from my lungs in a pained grunt. The rope unspooled. I wasn't climbing down. I was just falling in slow motion. I hit the end of the rope with a violent jolt that nearly ripped my arms from their sockets. I was hanging, spinning slowly, 30 feet above the ground. There was no climbing down. My arms had no strength. My hands were shredded. This was it. I looked down at the dark, wet earth, and I let go. Those 30 feet felt like a mile. I hit the ground hard, my legs buckling. The impact sent a shockwave of pure agony through my entire body, starting at my ankles and exploding in my chest. The world went black for a second. I came to, gasping, on a bed of wet ferns and pine needles. The smell of damp earth, fuel, and my own blood filled my lungs. I had made it. I was on the ground. I crawled, dragging myself, over to where Chloe lay. She was a still, broken heap at the base of the tree. "Chloe?" I whispered, shaking her. She groaned, her eyelids fluttering. Alive. She was alive. I collapsed next to her, the adrenaline leaving my body, replaced by a cold, heavy exhaustion. We were at the bottom of the tree. We were on the ground. We were also at the bottom of a canyon, in a forest so dense the sunlight barely touched the floor. Days 2 and 3 were a blur of misery. The cold on the ground was worse than in the tree. The wet earth seeped into our clothes, into our bones. I managed to crawl to a nearby stream, my body on fire, and bring back water in the plastic bag from the life vest. Chloe's leg was black. The infection was rampant. She was delirious, drifting in and out of consciousness, muttering about her family, about being late for class. I listened for helicopters. I scanned the tiny patch of sky I could see through the canopy. Nothing. The silence of the forest was absolute. We had survived the crash. We had survived the tree. And now, we were simply going to die here, slowly, of infection and exposure, 200 yards from a wreckage that no one would ever find in time. The hope I had manufactured to get us down the tree was gone. It evaporated into the cold, damp air, leaving only the grim, logical certainty of our end. By the morning of day 4, I had given up. Hope is a finite resource, and mine was exhausted. Chloe was barely conscious. Her breathing was shallow, her skin was hot to the touch, and her leg was a nightmare. The tourniquet was a failure, a desperate amateur move, and the infection was now systemic. She was dying. and I was sitting next to her, a useless cripple, watching it happen. I had dragged us both to the relative dryness under a massive fallen log, a few yards from the base of the tree that had been our prison. I had no food. The water from the stream tasted like metal and mud. I would huddle next to her, sharing what little body heat I had left, but I knew it was pointless. We were two tiny, insignificant specks in a green ocean the size of a country. My broken ribs ached with a dull, constant throb, a reminder of every breath I was still, inexplicably taking. And then I heard it. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a bird. It was a sound that didn't belong in this ancient forest. A deep, rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack that vibrated in my broken chest. A helicopter. My head snapped up, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs so hard I thought they would break all over again. "Chloe! Chloe, wake up!" I shook her shoulder. "They're here. They're looking for us." Her eyes didn't open. She just moaned, lost in her fever dream. I didn't care. I scrambled out from under the log, ignoring the searing pain. I stood in the small clearing at the base of our tree, staring up at the tiny patch of gray sky, visible through the 100-foot-tall canopy. The sound was getting louder. Thwack, thwack, thwack. It was close. It was right on top of us. "Hey!" I screamed, my voice cracking, raw from dehydration and disuse. "We're down here! Help! We're here!" I waved. My arms, a pathetic, broken marionette, jumping up and down in a circle. The sound was deafening now, a physical presence, but I couldn't see it. The canopy was too thick. They were blind. They were flying right over us, and they couldn't see a thing. I watched in pure, agonizing helplessness as the sound peaked and then began to fade. Thwack, 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 thwack. They were moving on. They were following the scar the fuselage had carved hundreds of yards away. They were leaving. "No!" I shrieked, the word tearing from my throat. "No, please, don't go. We're alive. We're here." But they were gone. The silence of the forest rushed back in, heavier and more oppressive than before. I collapsed onto my knees, the wet ferns soaking my pants. That was it. That was our one chance, and it had flown right over our heads. I put my head in my shredded hands and, for the first time since the engine stopped, I wept. I cried for the knitter, for the dead man, for Chloe, and for the sheer, stupid, cruel irony of it all. I stayed there on my knees for I don't know how long, defeated. But as I was staring at the ground, at the muddy carpet of pine needles and debris, my eyes caught something. Not a rock, not a branch. It was black, plastic, half buried in the mud, wedged against the root of the tree, was my laptop bag. It must have been torn from under the seat during the shredding, falling from the sky separately. I crawled to it, my hands shaking. It was soaked, muddy, and torn at the corners, but it was here. My laptop, the one I had been complaining about. I unzipped it. The laptop itself was a wreck. The screen was shattered. The case was cracked. It was full of water and dirt. It was useless. But the battery, my engineer's brain, the one I thought had died, sparked. A lithium-ion battery. If I could short-circuit it, I could make a spark. A spark wasn't a fire, but it was a start. I fumbled with the smashed case, my bloody fingers slipping on. The wet plastic. I managed to pry the battery pack out. It was a sealed unit. I looked around, desperate. The knitting needle, the one I had bent, it was still in my pocket. I jammed the metal needle into the battery's contacts, trying to cross the positive and negative terminals. Nothing. I tried again, angling it, scraping. A tiny pathetic sizzle, a wisp of smoke, and then a bright white-hot spark. It arced, and I dropped the battery in pain as it shocked my hand. But I had done it. I had a spark. Now I needed fuel. I needed something that would burn. The forest was soaked. The wood was wet. It would never catch. My eyes scanned the ground. The smell, that sweet, acrid smell that had been in my nose since I woke up. Jet fuel. The main wreckage was 200 yards away, but the wing on my side, my wing, had sheared off right over this spot. The ground here was saturated with it. I crawled, sniffing the air, digging my hands into the mud. The ferns were coated in a rainbow-colored, oily sheen. This was it. I grabbed handfuls of the driest pine needles I could find under the log, piling them up. I ripped the last dry pieces of the blue curtain fabric from my makeshift rope. I tore open the life vest I'd used to carry water and pulled out the dry foam insulation from inside. I made a small, pathetic pile. I put the battery next to it. "Okay, Alex," I whispered, my teeth chattering. "One more time." I jammed the needle into the contacts. A spark. Nothing. I repositioned the pile, adding more of the foam. I jammed it again. Spark. The foam hissed. A tiny orange ember began to glow. I blew on it, my lungs aching. The ember caught the fabric. A small, weak flame licked up. It was working. I grabbed handfuls of the fuel-soaked ferns and mud and piled them on top. It wasn't a fire for warmth. It was a fire for a signal. The wet leaves and the jet fuel wouldn't create a bright flame. They would create smoke. Thick, black, acrid smoke. A column of oily, dark gray smoke began to rise, struggling to get through the dense canopy. It wasn't enough. It was dissipating. "More!" I yelled at myself, crawling around, grabbing more handfuls of the oily mud, more branches, piling them onto the smoldering fire. The smoke got thicker, blacker. It was rising, a dirty pillar against the clean green. I stood back, waving my arms, screaming at the sky again, even though I could hear nothing. "Look here! Look here!" I don't know how long I stood there, feeding the fire, my entire world reduced to this one column of smoke. 5 minutes. 10. And then I heard it again. Thwack, thwack, thwack. It was coming back. This time it wasn't fading. It was getting louder, closer, heading straight for me. The sound became a hurricane. The trees around me bent as the downdraft from the helicopter hit the forest. Leaves and debris flew everywhere. I could see it now, through the branches. A massive gray military helicopter, a USAF Pave Hawk. It was hovering, impossibly, just above the canopy. I fell to my knees, all the strength gone from my body, just pointing at Chloe, pointing at myself. A door slid open. 2 figures, clad in black, appeared. They weren't looking at the main wreckage. They were looking right at me. One of them pointed back. They had seen us. They had seen the smoke. They had seen me. The world dissolved into a chaos of noise and motion. The 2 figures I saw were pararescue men, PJs, from the Air Force. They rappelled from the belly of the Pave Hawk, descending through the canopy like angels in combat gear. They hit the forest floor running. I tried to stand, to say something, but my legs gave out. I just pointed at Chloe, a weak, trembling finger. "Her," I croaked. "She's leg." One of them was on me in a second, his face calm, professional. "Sir, my name is Master Sergeant Davies. We've got you. You're safe." The other PJ was already at Chloe's side, a medic, tearing open packs, his hands moving with an efficiency that seemed superhuman. He looked at her leg and then looked at me, his eyes hard. "The tourniquet. You tied it?" I nodded dumbly. "It saved her life," he said before turning back to her, injecting her with something, barking commands into his radio. "We have 2 survivors. Priority 1 female, 22, traumatic amputation, septic. Priority 2 male, 32, blunt chest trauma, hypothermia, smoke inhalation." They were talking about us like we were data points. It was the most comforting sound I had ever heard. They loaded Chloe onto a steel litter. The helicopter couldn't land. The clearing was too small. They hoisted her up first, a tiny broken shape disappearing back into the sky. Then it was my turn. They strapped me onto a harness. "This is going to hurt, sir," Davies said, his voice tinny in my ear. He wasn't wrong. The moment the cable went taut, the harness compressed my broken ribs with agonizing force. I screamed. I think I blacked out as they pulled me up through the branches, spinning, up out of the green, wet hell, and into the gray, open sky. The next clear memory I have is of a hospital, Harborview Medical Center in Seattle. The sterile smell of antiseptic, the rhythmic electronic beep of a heart monitor, the blinding fluorescent lights. For a moment, I was confused. I was back in the tech conference. This was a hotel. Then I tried to take a deep breath and a hot stabbing pain shot through my chest. It all came flooding back. The silence, the pilot's scream, the tree, the cold. I ripped the oxygen mask off my face and tried to sit up. "Chloe!" A nurse rushed in, a kind-faced woman in blue scrubs. "Whoa! Easy there, Alex. Lie back down. You're safe. You're at Harborview. She gently pushed me back onto the pillows. You have 6 broken ribs, a punctured lung, severe hypothermia, and your hands, well, your hands are going to need some work. You've been here for 36 hours. The girl, I rasped, my throat raw. Chloe, the girl who was with me. Is she? I couldn't finish the sentence. What if I had killed her? What if I had dropped her from that tree just for her to die here? The nurse's expression softened. She put a hand on my arm. Chloe is alive. She's in surgery right now. She lost her leg, Alex, below the knee. The infection was severe. But the doctors, they say you saved her. That tourniquet, as crude as it was, and the fire, you saved her life. You both saved each other. I closed my eyes and the dam I hadn't even known I was holding finally broke. The single tear that escaped felt hotter than the fire I had built. She was alive. The next few days were a blur of doctors, medication, and pain. And then came the investigators. 2 people in sober suits, 1 man and 1 woman. They were from the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board. They sat in my room, their faces grim, a small audio recorder on the table between us. Mr. Mason, the woman said, her voice neutral. We know you've been through a horrific ordeal, but we need to know what you remember. We have the cockpit voice recorder, but we need your perspective. I told them everything. I told them about the Wi-Fi, the knitting woman, the sound of the engines just stopping. I told them about the silence, and then I told them about the door. The cockpit door, I said, my voice dropping. It blew open. From the stress, the torque, it ripped off the hinges. The 2 investigators looked at each other. This was new information. And you heard the pilot? The man asked, leaning forward. I heard him, I whispered, the memory as clear as if it were happening right now. He wasn't on the intercom. It was his voice. He screamed. Brace, brace. We lost all engines. We're going in. The woman from the NTSB closed her eyes for a second. The man just wrote in his notepad. They confirmed it later. A catastrophic dual-engine flameout caused by a freak ice ingestion that the anti-icing systems, for some reason, failed to prevent. The pilots were heroes, they said. They had fought the plane all the way down, trying to find a clearing, trying to land it in the trees to soften the impact. Their actions, though futile in the end, were what allowed my small section to break off instead of being pulverized. The media came next. They were vultures, camped outside my hospital room. The miracle of Flight 203. The man who fell from the sky and lived. They wanted a hero story. They wanted to hear about my bravery, about my ingenious plan. They didn't want to hear the truth. They didn't want to hear about the sound Chloe made when I pulled her leg free. They didn't want to hear about the dead man whose seatbelt I stole. They didn't want to hear about the moment I let go of the rope and dropped a girl 30 feet to the ground. I wasn't a hero. I was just the engineer who happened to be sitting in the one piece of the plane that got caught in a tree. But the real trauma wasn't the interviews. It was the nights. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I wasn't in a hospital bed. I was in seat 12F. I was hanging sideways. I would wake up, covered in sweat, my heart hammering, gasping for air, my hands clenched so tight my nails dug into my raw palms. The silence. The silence was the worst part. Any time the room got too quiet, I could hear it. That profound, unnatural absence of sound from 30,000 feet. That, and the pilot's final, hopeless scream. I've been home for 6 months now. My apartment in Seattle is the same gray couch, the same view of the Space Needle in the distance. But I am not the same. I don't think I'll ever be Alex Mason, software engineer again. That person died in the tree. This new person, the one who looks in the mirror, is a ghost who walks with a limp I didn't have before, and who carries a map of scars on his hands and chest. The ribs healed, the lung reinflated, the skin on. My palms grew back. But the silence never leaves. I can be in the middle of a crowded street, and all I'll hear is that sudden, terrifying absence of the engines. I can't fly. I tried, once. My company, in a staggering display of tone deafness, wanted me to fly back to Boise for a post-incident debrief. I made it as far as the jet bridge. I saw the narrow carpeted tube, smelled that recycled canned air, and I couldn't move. My lungs seized up. I was back in the Q400 hanging, sideways, smelling pine and fuel. I turned around, walked out of the airport, got in my car. and drove home, shaking so hard I could barely hold the wheel. I quit my job the next day. The Wi-Fi doesn't seem very important anymore. The world doesn't make sense to me in the way it used to. My old life was built on logic, on data, on the comforting certainty of probabilities. The odds of a dual-engine failure like that, 1 in a billion, maybe more. The odds of surviving the impact, 0. The odds of the one section that broke off being caught by a tree, 100 feet in the air, instead of being pulverized on the ground, infinitesimal. I am a walking, talking, statistical impossibility. And when you become the exception to every rule, the rules don't mean anything anymore. I went to see Chloe. I had to. I was terrified. I was the man who had pulled her from that spike. I was the man who had given her that scar, that new life. I was the man who had dropped her 30 feet to the ground. I walked into the rehab center, and she was there, in a brightly lit gym, learning to walk. She has a new leg, a sleek, futuristic thing made of carbon fiber and titanium. She was sweating, her face tight with concentration, as she took a step, then another. She saw me. Her face didn't register fear, or anger, or resentment. She smiled. A real, genuine smile. She let go of the parallel bars and hobbled over to me, hugging me so tight it hurt my still tender ribs. "You came," she just whispered. I think I started to cry first. "Chloe, your leg. I'm so sorry I did that. I dropped you." She pulled back and looked at me, her eyes fierce. "Alex, listen to me," she said, her voice steady. "You didn't do this to me. The plane did this. You were the only reason I wasn't on that mountain when the PJs found us. You made me eat. You kept me from bleeding out. You built a rope out of garbage. You saved me. Don't you ever be sorry." She told me she was going back to school. She was studying to be an architect. Now she wants to design accessible buildings. She had found a purpose. Maybe I thought I could too. I still think about the trees, the cascades, those giant ancient Douglas firs. I saw them as missiles, as green spears coming up to kill us. But I was wrong. The forest wasn't cruel. It wasn't kind. It was just there. The same branches that ripped our wing off and tore the fuselage to shreds were the ones that caught us. The same tree that impaled us in the sky also held us safe, like a giant wooden hand, keeping us from the certain death of the forest floor. It was a violent, terrible, beautiful paradox. Nature didn't care about our flight plan. It just was. I don't live in the city anymore. I moved out a month ago. I have a small cabin now, just east of the mountains. I'm surrounded by trees. People think I'm crazy. The therapists say I'm engaging in avoidance behavior. Maybe I am, but I feel safer here. The silence of the forest is different now. It's not the empty, terrifying silence of 30,000 feet. It's a living silence, filled with the sound of wind in the pines, of birds, of life. I spend my days just walking. I learned the names of the trees: Douglas fir, western red cedar. I am the human black box. The NTSB has the data, but I have the feeling. I remember the smell of the pine, the taste of the rain, the sound of that final, hopeless scream. I survived. I don't know why. There's no logic to it, but I'm here. Every morning I wake up and I feel the air in my lungs, and it feels like a miracle. It feels like a second chance I never asked for, and one I have no idea how to use. But I'm trying. Every single day I'm trying. My name is Alex Mason. I was a passenger on Flight 203, and I'm the one who walked away. The world is full of impossible stories, of people who walked through the fire and came out the other side. My story is just one of them. If you want to hear more incredible stories of survival, of people who face the impossible and refuse to give in, make sure you subscribe to this channel and turn on the notifications. You never know whose strength will inspire your own.